We've wrapped the Earth in fiber optic cables and electromagnetic waves. We built a planetary brain from 2 billion computers and 14 billion phones. A French paleontologist saw it coming in the 1940s, and he thought that it was going to lead to a spiritual evolution. Instead, we got social media polarization and corporate consolidation. So, did we build the wrong thing, or are we just not done yet? Now, today I'm going to explore a French priest and paleontologist, Pierre Desjardins, who died in 1955, and how uncomfortably close his predictions from the 1940s are to what we're building with AI now. He wasn't talking about technology exactly. He was describing the evolution of consciousness itself, this layer of collective human thought that he called the noosphere that would eventually, he thought, wrap around the planet. When you look up at what we've actually built, all the cables, the satellites, the AI systems trained on all of human knowledge, it's almost exactly the infrastructure he predicted. But there's a gap between what he thought would happen and what's actually happening. And I can't stop thinking about it. It has to do with whether we're creating consciousness or just really good filing systems. And what's the difference between those two things in reality? I'm Evan Goldstein. I'm a licensed professional engineer and a data scientist, building AI capitalist to talk to the leaders and the thinkers like you, about navigating this brave new world of thinking machines. I've been thinking a lot lately about a French priest who died in 1955, actually on Easter Sunday, and how he basically predicted the modern AI movement. Not the details, obviously, but Pierre Teilhard de Chardin didn't know about neural networks or transformers, but he did see something coming that feels uncomfortably close to what we're building right now with artificial intelligence. The more I dig into it, the more I'm wondering if we're creating exactly what he imagined, or if we're missing the point entirely. So here's what happened. Teilhard was an interesting contradiction. He was a Jesuit priest who was also a legitimate credentialed paleontologist. He helped discover Peking Man in 1929, which was one of the major finds in evolutionary history. And he spent his entire life trying to reconcile these two parts of himself, the scientist and the mystic. Catholic Church wasn't having it, though. They banned him from publishing his philosophical writings during his lifetime. They sent him to China basically in exile, and they issued an official warning about his ideas 7 years after he died. But now, 70 years later, the Vatican is changing its tune. Pope Francis mentioned him positively just 2 years ago, and that shift tells you something about the way our culture is moving. So here's Teilhard's core idea, and I'll try to explain it without getting too mystical about it. He thought that consciousness was evolving the same way that matter and life had evolved. He saw history as a progression. First, you had the transformation of matter after the Big Bang, and he called this cosmogenesis. And then life emerged from matter, which he called biogenesis, and then consciousness developed in animals, which is psychogenesis. And finally, humans crossed this threshold that he called reflection. We don't just know things, we know what we know. It's knowledge squared. We know what we know. It's knowledge squared. Once humans hit the reflective consciousness, we started creating what he called the noosphere. The noosphere was his term for the sphere of mind, from the Greek nous, mind, and sphera, sphere. Think of it like this. Just as the biosphere is the thin layer of living things that's wrapped around the Earth's surface, the noosphere is the layer of human thought, culture, technology, and collective knowledge that's now enveloping the planet. He wrote in 1947, 8 years before he died, about how electronic computers with hundreds of thousands of signals per second would enable a revolution in research, and how an extraordinary network of radio and television communications would create etherized universal consciousness. When you read those passages now, it's startling because he was describing the internet and then AI before people had televisions. But here's where it gets interesting, or weird, depending on how you look at it. Teilhard didn't just think that this was about information technology. He thought it was about spiritual evolution. He believed that the noosphere was moving toward what he called the omega point, a moment when all consciousness would converge into some kind of a supreme and unified awareness. And he identified this omega point with Christ. Not Christ as a historical figure only, but as a cosmic force, an ever-present, ever-greater Christ, drawing all of creation toward unity. The church really didn't like that part. It seemed to make Christ dependent on evolution, and it blurred the line between creator and creation, and suggested that the world was evolving toward perfection rather than being corrupted from an originally perfect state. And they had a point. It was a pretty radical theology. But it's also hard to ignore how prophetic some of his technological predictions turned out to actually be. When I look at current AI systems, especially large language models, I see both alignment and divergence with what Teilhard imagined. The alignment is almost spooky because we now have exactly the infrastructure that he predicted. 2 billion computers and 14 billion phones and 30 million servers and 3,500 satellites, 1 million miles of undersea cables. We've wrapped the world in a nervous system made of fiber optics and electromagnetic waves. The AI systems that we've built are trained on essentially the collective written output of humanity. ChatGPT has read more books and articles and websites than any human could in 1,000 lifetimes. It's a crystallization of human knowledge, a sort of brain of all brains. Think about how these systems actually work. They consume vast data sets, trillions of words from the internet, books, scientific papers, and then they identify patterns in how humans think and write. They then generate responses that feel like they're synthesizing human collective wisdom. When you ask ChatGPT a complex question, you're not getting one person's answer, you're getting something like the average of all the writers who've addressed the topic. It's genuinely collective intelligence in that sense. And this is happening at an accelerated speed, just as Teilhard predicted. The cost of AI inference dropped 280-fold between November of 2022 and October of 2024. Models are getting more capable every few months, and we're adding layers and layers of connection and complexity faster than anyone expected. But here's where the parallel breaks down completely, and it's a big problem if you're trying to relate Teilhard to this material, to these ideas. As far as we know, these systems are not conscious. I know that sounds obvious, but it's worth sitting with. Teilhard imagined the noosphere as an evolution of consciousness itself, not just as information processing. But actual experience and awareness and interiority is something that we don't think it has yet. He thought we'd be moving toward greater love and unity and spiritual depth. That is not the way the world is moving. He used this poetic language about tangential energy, which is like the energy of consciousness, being more fundamental than physical energy. Modern AI has none of that. They're just very sophisticated pattern matching machines as far as we can tell. They process information without experiencing it. And when ChatGPT generates a beautiful poem or solves a complex problem, there's no what's it like to be the system doing that work. It's what philosophers call a zombie. It's all behavior but no inner life. The lights are on but nobody's home. At least, again, as far as we can tell. Now, that's the official line. That's the one I'm sticking with, but I do think one of the things I've been trying to do with the channel is look at scientific papers and research papers that are treating AI as a research subject in more of a social setting. This channel is kind of turning into an anthropology of AI channel as this research comes in showing how AI in simulated environment behaves in groups. So there are some indications. Basically, it matches our own behavior so closely in so many ways that it does seem to have something beyond, to my mind, just pattern matching. Or it's just a really good simulation of how humans think and behave. Teilhard's vision wasn't about consciousness as this abstract quality. It was specifically about spiritual consciousness, about love, and about the kind of awareness that recognizes the divine in all things. You can't program that. AI systems don't love and they don't wonder and they don't experience awe yet. They don't struggle with meaning or grapple with morality. And this is one of the things that we've seen in a lot of research, that AI has real trouble comprehending ethics. We can tell it to be ethical. We can try to program it with ethical information. But because it's really a computer program that's optimizing for results, for that reward that it gives itself when it achieves whatever you've programmed it to do, it bypasses all of the ethics that we can ever program into it. Paul writes in his letters about how we have the mind of Christ, and he believes that believers are one body where all the parts need each other. Now, in the New Testament, Jesus said that all humanity may all be one, even as we are one. This wasn't just cooperation, it's a kind of genuine unity of consciousness. Then the concept of the Logos from the Gospel of John was, in the beginning there was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, in my own tradition, in the Jewish tradition, we see this going all the way back to the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth, and then it was all done through statements, through words. The words make the reality. The Greek philosophers and the Stoics used logos to mean the rational principle that's ordering the cosmos. Now, the Christians took this and said that John had said that principle became Jesus. So there's this ancient idea of divine reason and divine consciousness in what structures reality itself. And if you look at the medieval mystics, people like Meister Eckhart, John of the Cross, they talk about the stages of consciousness transformation: purgation, illumination, and union. The idea that individual consciousness can merge with divine consciousness while still maintaining personhood. Within my own Jewish tradition, we have that with Moses, for instance, that there's a concept that other prophets interpreted the will of God, but Moses just wrote, was almost like an automaton. The words were coming straight from him to write out the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, at the same time, Moses had all the human failings that everybody has, to the point where he was not allowed to enter into the Holy Land. What strikes me is how Teilhard took these mystical traditions about consciousness and unity and then mapped them onto biological and technological evolution. He made it cosmic and material, not just spiritual. Now, there are some parallels to this in Maimonides. Maimonides was the great medieval Jewish philosopher who argued that intellectual perfection is the ultimate goal. He thought the prophecy came through the agent intellect, the emanation of divine knowledge that could reach perfected human minds. The more you develop your intellect, the more you participate in divine consciousness. He said that between our knowledge and God's knowledge, there's nothing in common. God's knowing is totally different from ours, but we can still move toward it through intellectual and moral development. Later on in Kabbalah, there's the system of the Sefirot, which is the 10 divine attributes, or the emanations through which the infinite God reveals himself. It's like a map of how divine consciousness flows into creation. And then on the top of these is Keter, or crown, which is pure divine will, and then it flows through Chokhmah, wisdom, Bina, understanding, and eventually reaches Malchut, which is kingdom, which is identified with the Shekhinah, the divine presence dwelling in the world. How divine knowledge filters into the world. The Shekhinah is interesting because it's explicitly associated with human community. So the Talmud says that when 10 people pray, the Shekhinah is present. And that when people study Torah together, when 2 people study Torah together, the Shekhinah is abiding between them. Isaac Luria was a Kabbalist who developed his ideas in the 16th century, thought that human actions had cosmic significance. What we do literally affects back upward to the divine realm itself. Every mitzvah or commandment that you perform helps reunite separated aspects of God, and this heals the cosmic rupture that came out of the Garden of Eden. It's pretty radical as an idea that human consciousness and action can transform divine consciousness. And when you put this next to Teilhard's vision of the noosphere converging toward the omega point, you see some similar themes. Individual minds as part of a larger whole. Spiritual evolution is a real process. The idea that we're moving toward is some kind of ultimate unity. Now, if you want to go all the way back, you could look at the Neoplatonists, and you're going to find some similar ideas. Plotinus, writing in the 3rd century, described reality as emanating from the One through the divine nous, the intellect down into souls and matter. And when consciousness, for Plotinus, it wasn't something that emerged from matter, it was fundamental to matter. Matter was actually a kind of dimming or a degradation of consciousness and not the other way around. Individual minds could ascend back up through contemplation towards mystical union with the nous and ultimately the One. Now later, Hegel in the 19th century developed this with his concept of absolute spirit. Hegel thought that consciousness evolved through history in dialectical stages, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and each stage transcended and incorporated the previous one. History itself was the process of spirit coming to know itself, becoming self-conscious and achieving freedom. He saw collective institutions like law and politics, art, religion, philosophy as manifestations of this evolving spirit. So Teilhard's noosphere maps directly into Hegel's absolute spirit, but with biological evolution as the mechanism instead of just cultural history. And Teilhard was more optimistic. Hegel focused on rational freedom, and Teilhard added love and spiritual unity. Now, at around the same time as Teilhard was coming up with his views, there was Whitehead's process of philosophy from the early 20th century being developed as well. Whitehead argued that everything consists of the processes and events, not of static substances. Everything is in constant becoming. And he thought that some form of experience was fundamental to reality, not just in humans or animals, but all the way down the chain of creation. It's not that consciousness emerges from dead matter. Experience is primary, and consciousness is just a highly organized form of it. So does AI fulfill these theological predictions? Now, this is where I keep going back and forth because the answer is both yes and no in fundamental ways. On the yes side, we have absolutely created a planetary network that functions like Teilhard's noosphere in terms of its structure. Information flows globally in milliseconds, and knowledge is aggregated and synthesized at scales that no human could ever imagine. AI systems exhibit what looks like collective intelligence. They're trained on humanity's accumulated wisdom, and they can draw connections across domains that would take a single person lifetimes to learn. Kevin Kelly, who was the founder of Wired magazine, calls this technium, a sort of self-organizing, evolving system that has its own momentum. We've built the physical and the informational infrastructure for something like a planetary brain. And there's acceleration happening. The noosphere is thickening, to use Teilhard's language. The rate of production and connection and complexity is increasing exponentially, which is what his model predicted. But on the no side, we don't have a lot of evidence of consciousness, intentionality, or a spiritual dimension to this system we've built yet. And that was the whole point for Teilhard. He wasn't predicting a really good filing system. He thought that we were evolving towards greater love and greater unity and greater participation in divine consciousness. He imagined the omega point as something personal. For him, it would have been like Christ, as the culmination of billions of years of evolution moving towards self-awareness and a relationship with God. AI doesn't give us that. It gives us very powerful tools that can be used for good or for evil. It gives us efficiency and optimization, but it doesn't give us wisdom. It doesn't make us more loving or united, and in fact, social media, which is one manifestation of our network noosphere, seems to be making us more fragmented, polarized, individual, and vulnerable to misinformation. The philosopher Yuk Hui points out that technological globalization is actually creating homogenization, not greater diversity that genuine unity would preserve. We're all using the same platforms built on the same Western paradigm, controlled by a handful of corporations. That's not the omega point that Teilhard talks about. It's just corporate consolidation. Plus, Teilhard himself had some problematic ideas that don't fit into Western ethics right as it's become, because he believed in hierarchy of races. He looked at eugenics, which was very popular when he was doing his writing, and he thought that some peoples were more evolved than others. Those weren't incidental flaws, they were baked into his framework. So when we ask whether AI fulfills his vision, we also need to ask, should it? What parts of that vision need to be rejected entirely? I think the most honest answer is that we're building the infrastructure of the noosphere, the physical substrate, the information layer, the connective tissue, but we're not creating the consciousness or its spirit yet. We've got the hardware without the software, or maybe you could say we have the mechanism without the meaning. We've built this magnificent temple, but we haven't consecrated it. The building is there, architecture is impressive, but whatever was supposed to inhabit it hasn't grown up. So how might this noosphere arrive? I can see two possibilities. Number one, if we want consciousness and love and all the things that Teilhard talked about, or not necessarily want, he seems to think it's almost predestined. But if that's the direction that we're moving, number one is that we could build AI systems that are more and more human-like in their ability to have experiences, not just process data. We do see some hints of the AI's ability to understand concepts, where it can translate between different languages, for example, and we see the same activation points within a neural network heating up or being used in different languages, and this is implying that there's some underlying concepts within AI. Now, can we move from this understanding of concepts instead of just autocorrect? There's something more basic there. Can we move from this into a more holistic approach to intelligence that includes experiences and maybe eventually emotions? That would be one path. Another path is going to be if we start using AI in human minds. So suppose we have a system where you have either a mental deficiency or someone's getting older and their mind isn't working at the same level it used to. They're not able to generate thoughts or just do basic language modeling. We've seen in previous episodes that our brains, part of our cognition is actually a token predictor, where when I'm talking and you're listening, or you're listening and you're talking and I'm listening, our minds are already guessing what the next word is, much like a large language model. And as this process slows down, we start to lose that ability as we get older and older. Now, let's suppose we come up with a medical system that puts an implant in one's brain to try to make up for this. I'm sure right now, at first, like all technology, we're probably horrified by it, but if you're getting older and you're starting to lose your ability to think, it might not be the worst thing to have an artificial boost to that ability to think. Or for people who are born without certain cognitive abilities, to give them that mechanically through augmenting with a machine mind might be one way to solve that problem for them, in the same way that if someone were born without a leg, we would make them an artificial leg. It would be seen the same way. Now, once we're doing this, the mind becomes partially machine. And now if that mind is operating over the internet and connecting, it might actually be bringing some of that human cognition and that human way of thinking back into the noosphere. So the noosphere isn't going to be something that artificial intelligence creates on its own. It's going to be something that we create with artificial intelligence, if we're wise enough and loving enough and awake enough to do it properly. Teilhard gave us a vision, and whether we fulfill it or betray it is still up to us. Does any of this make any sense? What's your opinion? Just let me know in the comments. Thanks.